Well, good evening. This is Truth Seeker, Atheist here, and wanted to make a video about a video that I saw recently. Um, my subscribers, I'm a little tired, long day, and intense discussions, and my brain's a little on the fried side. But anyway, I wanted to respond to a video that I saw a couple days ago by one of the people that I really enjoy the most. I have a list of recommended channels on my channel for those who are subscribed to my channel. They'll see recommended channels, and one of them is Telltale Atheist. Now, I really enjoy Telltale Atheist. He's an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and he does many videos on Jehovah's Witnesses, but he tends to broaden his sphere of things to address a little bit more broadly, let's say, than John Cedars, who is nearly exclusively Jehovah's Witness. And Telltale will broaden out to other religions, and quite a bit of his interest deals with whether or not a religion constitutes a cult. I take the position more similarly to Christopher Hitchens, who said that if it's religion, it's dangerous. All religions are dangerous. And I think there's historical precedent for that position. 1,000 years ago, there was the Spanish Inquisition. Maybe it wasn't quite that long ago, but it was the Catholic Church for quite a long period of time was a very dangerous institution. You couldn't really oppose the Pope or Catholicism. Those who protested against certain practices found themselves on a stake of burning wood below them. There were there was a lot of fear, a lot of terror that was used by the Catholic Church. And so they were a powerful institution, one to be feared, and their fear of excommunication, their fear of death, the use of fear of death, was very, very useful to them in spreading their version of Christianity throughout Europe during the Dark Ages, during the Middle Ages, up until around the French Revolution, when things began to change. And this is why I think that all religions can be potentially dangerous. The Christianity didn't start out dangerous as a religion. It transformed itself into something dangerous over time. But it wasn't always that way. It was a small cultish sect when it first started. I would say the Watchtower organization is a good example of a Christian organization that morphed or evolved over time from something rather benign. It may have been a cult or a personality cult, but it didn't have the power or control over individuals' lives in quite the negative sense that Watchtower now has control over its people's lives. It can make life hell for their members. Use of fear, the use of shame, guilt, so on is strongly prevalent within the Watchtower. It wasn't always that way. Initially, it was quite a bit less so. It was still, I think, a cult, but it wasn't as dangerous a cult as it is today. But I think that because of the potential that religion has to become dangerous to people, that all religions have that potential. I mean, there are Protestant sects that today are dangerous religions. Westford Baptist Church, for example. So it can happen. It can happen to any religion, and so I think, and it's because of the element of irrationality. I mean, religion forces people to lose their ability to think critically, to think rationally, and so I think that danger is always there, especially when you're the ones that are holding the banner of truth and God's standard and standing up for God's righteous truth. It can morph or change to something increasingly controlling over people's lives. But the reason for this video actually is, as I said earlier, it's a response mainly to a video that I saw the other day from Telltale Atheist, and I have quite a bit of respect for Telltale. I think that he really does a pretty good job, generally, with his research, with his approach. I think that his logic is generally good, and he really calls out many religions for the irrational elements or dangerous elements that reside within them, within their belief systems. But recently, I think it's his most recent video where he says I think it's revisiting whether or not Jehovah's Witnesses constitute a cult. And what he does is he takes Stephen Hassan's BITE model. Now, Stephen Hassan, for I think many people are really aware of him. He's probably one of the more prominent individuals who psychologist, PhD psychologist who specializes in cult control, cult behavior, and how to help people deal with family members who are in a cult, and how to help them move out of a cult. So I guess in the early days they literally captured people, kidnapped them out of the cult, concerned family members, and they would have them locked in basements, literally kidnapping them and going through a deprogramming process until they came to their senses and realized that they were being manipulated by a cult. That happened to Stephen Hassan himself, and that led to his interest in the whole matter about how he got inducted into the Moonies in particular, and that led to his interest in psychology and getting his PhD in psychology and focusing on cults and their ability to control people and the techniques used by cults to control people. And over the recent years, Stephen Hassan has taken the various mechanisms, control, characteristics, criteria that are employed by cults in general, no matter what cult it is, and how they exploit individuals using these techniques. And if you go to his website, you'll see that he now has taken the various characteristics and organized them into a model that he calls the BITE model. BITE standing for behavior, behavioral control. These are various. This is in the broad sense. The control aspects or areas that are used to or manipulated or controlled by a cult. Behavior, information, thought, and emotion, and thus the acronym BITE. And he lumps a whole bunch of criteria underneath each category. And so for behavior, if you go to his website, there might be 20 different items under there where you can look at these particular things, and if they're present or if they're being used, then you're likely dealing with a cult. And I took a look at these different things, and I boiled them down to a few categories rather than 20 different categories or subcategories to each major category. I believe that I kind of grouped them into smaller groups, and they cover things such as under behavior. There are characteristics where they use for isolating, isolating individuals and controlling time. Isolation and time. Sex. There are a number of items there where sex is involved. How they have sex, whether or not rape is used, whether or not it's sinful to masturbate, and but there are a number of different ways in which sex is controlled, and so I just used a broader category of sex, behavior, dress, hygiene, diet, behavior, rules, reward and punishment, and financial. And then information, again, relates back to isolation. Some of these things relate back to each other. They really do strongly correlate, correlate very strongly with one another. So information control, isolation is used in information control. What you can read, what you're not allowed to read, controls over media, what to watch, what you can listen to, self-disclosure about yourself, revealing information about yourself. A good example of that would be in Scientology, where you're audited and you reveal yourself. There are organizations that use spying, and then you can't trust your neighbor. You have to watch how you behave, because your neighbor, your friend, your best friend may take that information and use it to get you in trouble. And so gaslighting is another means of information control, in which I would think that gaslighting would be more under thought control, about how you made to doubt yourself and your own senses. But some of these things, really do kind of cross over from one category to another. Then thought control. There's definitely indoctrination. They control what you think. They use the ploy that they have the truth. identity control, who you are. They define you. Usually it's something where you are a sinful being in need of their form of salvation. And, identity control, they use fear and shame. So emotional controls are involved in identity control, but identity control is a way of thinking and a way of how you identify yourself. I understand that very well from the way I grew up. That when I wasn't elected an elder as a young man, I was devastated because my identity, how I valued myself, was so strongly tied in with what I had been taught. Was the expectation for a young man in our religion that it just nearly destroyed me and my sense of who I was. Splitting is common in thought control. Splitting is black and white thinking. The world is a black and white world, and that's a common thought control ploy. Contradiction, which leads to cognitive dissonance, suspension of critical thinking, so in the area of thought control, and then the use of emotions, which also ties back to the suspension of critical thinking, and feel good, over rational thinking, fear, the use of fear, guilt, shame, the fear of loss of salvation, the technique of love bombing and withholding love, and fellowship. So there's these things can be narrowed down to a number of criteria that I think are more of the broader categories of this BITE model. But what Telltale did was something that went beyond what Stephen Hassan did. Now, Stephen Hassan was more concerned with, are these characteristics present in the religion or the cult of interest, and whether or not it constitutes a cult. I'm not quite sure why Telltale wanted to do this. But he took the BITE model and added a scoring system to it that, first off, was somewhat arbitrary. The choice of how he went about, selecting the method of scoring. And what he did was he used the Fibonacci sequence as a way of scoring the different characteristics in the BITE model, and there are a number of problems with doing that. First off, I'm not sure it's really necessary. Am I? Why would first off, why would I want to know why? If a cult is, if something is a cult, I'm not going to want to be involved in it. If I'm on the outside, I'm just not going to get involved, regardless of, There's no good cult in my estimation. They're all destructive in some way, and they're all dangerous in some way, both to the individuals in the cult and to society in general. I kind of broaden that out to Christopher Hitchens' There's No Safe Religion. He says all religion is dangerous, and I'll qualify that. Well, I mentioned that earlier when I talked about the Catholicism and how dangerous Catholicism was, and how dangerous it was to defy the Pope. You might find yourself on a pile of burning wood. Today, Catholicism, you can say anything you want about the Pope, and you're not going to find yourself burning. So Catholicism has mollified quite a bit and has become more or less benign as religions go. Um, but am I going to leave, let's say, the Westford Baptist Church for Scientology because it scored lower on my cult assessment scale? No. I mean, so I don't understand really necessarily the purpose. And again, why do I, if it's a cult, why do I need to know how bad the cult is? Unless I'm going to get mixed into it somehow, and I'm going to find myself in some sort of danger, kidnapped or missing or something. I don't know. But outside of that, I'm not going to mess with a cult. If it's a cult, I'm going to hands off. I'm not going to get involved. So I don't understand the necessity of trying to rate a cult, and for interest's sake, maybe, I don't know, where they lie on the spectrum of cultum. What is the spectrum of cultum? I don't know. One of the problems with using the Fibonacci sequence is it's an infinite sequence. There's no top to the scale. So there, again, it was kind of an arbitrary selection because initially the differences between, let's say, levels are small. The Fibonacci sequence, if you guys, I wrote it out here. I've spoken about this before because I'm a Fibonacci. I have a lot of interest. The Fibonacci sequence is a very interesting sequence. It's found throughout nature. It's so interesting that a mathematical society of academic mathematicians over the globe have formed a society called the Fibonacci Society in 1963, and these are academic mathematicians, and they print a quarterly magazine called the Fibonacci Quarterly, and in it it's all esoteric mathematics that are related to the Fibonacci sequence and the golden mean. And because the golden number or golden mean is innately or is inherent within the Fibonacci sequence, but the Fibonacci sequence, which is something I did go over in one of my videos, I have put the algebraic expression up there. What that says, fn plus 1 equals f sub n plus f sub n minus 1, all that says is you always add the two last numbers in the sequence to generate the next number. Again, you can go on to infinity with this sequence. So starting out with 1 and 1, you add them up to get 2. 2 and 1 gives you 3. 2 and 3 gives you 5. 5 and 8 is 13. 13 and 8 is 21. And then 34, 55, 34 and 55 is 89. 89 and 55 is 144. And the one thing that you should be noticing is the increase in gaps. Now, you only go up one increment. N, for example, is the increment. N is, here we have N is 1 through 12, but the gap between N11, N equals 11 and N equals 12 is 55, is a gap of 55, whereas where you have N is 2 and 3, you only have a gap of an increment of 1. So if you go one level at the low end of the sequence, you only have small changes, and at the higher end of the range of the sequence, the gap increases nearly exponentially. And I kind of drew it out by hand. The bottom axis is n, and the vertical axis is the f sub n, or the Fibonacci number corresponding with n. And you can see the first two are 1 and 1, and then 3, n is 3, gives you 2, n is 4 gives you 3, n is 5 gives you 5, n is 6 gives you 8, and you can see kind of visually there that you get a curve, almost like a curve that you see down at the bottom here that I've drawn, x and y axis, and that's an exponential curve, y equals e to the x. And so Fibonacci sequence kind of mimics an exponential progression. So my question is the validity behind, when Telltale was going through his criteria, I found myself scoring, trying to figure out, guessing what score he would guess before he actually said it. He would name the criteria, and I would assess it, and I say, well, I would give it an 8, and he would give it a 5. And he go on to the next criterion, and he would say, I think that's a really high score, so I'll give it a 21, when I thought maybe a 13. And sometimes I agreed, my guess agreed with his assessment, and most times we didn't. The problem I see with that is that when you're only left with choices when you have the high end that leave huge differences in the score. So when you say, I think I've got a high score here for sex, okay, or isolation. Let's say isolation. Scientology really isolates you maybe more than Watchtower does. And so I'm going to give that a really high score. I give them a 34. Well, and Watchtower I would give a 21. Well, that's a big gap. And when he came out with his threshold score, that for each, if for behavior or for information control or thought control or emotional control, a score of 100 would constitute a cult. Well, first off, I don't think that a score of 100 in any one characteristic necessarily makes the whole system a cult, because you've left out 3 other important areas, large, broad areas. Let's say you got 100 in emotional control, but you were below 100 on all the others, maybe significantly, then you don't have a cult. But then again, these things so strongly correlate that it's hard to really say that you're going to have a score that, that if emotional control ties in very strongly with thought and behavior control. So I think it's kind of arbitrary, especially just setting a threshold of 100. I mean, a couple of high scores will throw the score off very highly, and with a small subjective difference, I may differ a little bit, but the gap is huge because that's using the Fibonacci scoring model. So I don't think that the Fibonacci sequence is necessarily the appropriate way to score this. Secondly, I think it's a creative idea, and I don't think it's necessarily is something that is invalid from to think about scoring these things. I mean, psychopathy is scored. A number of other psychological things are scored to determine actually the threshold into psychopathy. But again, as I said before, I don't necessarily think it's really necessary. It's a binary thing to me. If it's a cult, it's a cult. If it isn't, it isn't. So maybe a scoring model where ones and zeros is more appropriate, and you sum up the score, and if it's over a certain threshold, it's a cult. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about the degree to which it's a cult, and it's not necessarily important to know the degree to which it's a cult. So that's why I object somewhat to the use of the Fibonacci sequence. The other thing is that I'm not sure that there was a whole lot of real care or thought. It's very subjective. There isn't, I found myself scoring differently more times than not. And not necessarily that we were in a great deal of disagreement, but just because of the Fibonacci sequence, it created a huge gap in our assessment because of the great gaps that are inherent to the Fibonacci sequence. So, I think that poses a problem with this Fibonacci scoring model. And second, it's not something that I think something like this takes years of study and years of knowledge about the particular thing that you score, and that you have to be working with other individuals on this to have the peer agreement that the model is valid. Now let me use psychopathy as an example. Now here is the Hare psychopathy checklist, and Robert Hare is probably the world's foremost expert in the study and area, the area of study, psychological study of psychopathy. Robert Hare is a Canadian who looked at the criminal system in Canada and did a lot of work with the individuals in jail, especially recidivism, where people were continually being put into jail, going out, and being, committing more crimes and so on. He found that the majority of these people were psychopaths, that as much as 30% of the prison population is psychopathic. And not that all psychopaths are necessarily criminals, but that the majority or a large segment of people with psychological problems, issues, mental illness are psychopaths in prison. So I'm wondering if this is recording. Actually, I'm not really good at this. So Robert Hare eventually, through his studies, came out with a checklist of 20 items. And in that checklist, there are 20 different characteristics that he put together: glib, superficial charm, pathological liar, grandiose, they're easily bored, need stimulation, cunning, manipulative, and so on. And he came out with this list and a scoring model for determining whether an individual was a psychopath or not. And the scoring wasn't anything very terribly sophisticated. It was simply a 0, 1, and a 2. And there was a top score. Again, there's no such thing as an infinite psychopath. So the highest a person could score on the test was 40. And of course, the lowest would be 0, which means that you're not a psychopath at all, completely opposite. And the threshold for psychopathy was a score of 30. So if you scored 30 or above, you were considered to be a psychopath. So it was a very simple system. It wasn't very elaborate, and it got into a measure of degree to which this person may be a psychopath. If they had a high score of 40, they were quite psychopathic. If they had a score of 29, they had strong psychopathic tendencies. A score of 30 and above put them in the realm of being a psychopath. And that provided quite a bit of information, because psychopaths are not only criminals, but 1% of the population is thought to be psychopath. And when you have 350 or how many other, how many people are in the U.S., 309 million, I forget exactly, but 1% of 300 million is 3 million. 3 million psychopaths. Well, we don't have 3 million people in jail, so they're out there in society. And it's found that people, especially psychopaths, will gravitate to positions such as CEO of a company, mainly because they have no empathy. They have they don't care who they hurt on the way up, whose feet they step on, and so on. It's something that is prevalent, and more prevalent than you would hope it would be. So it's kind of a scary situation to think about. But the scoring system meant something. It was capped, it's peer-reviewed, and it relates to something tangible, and there isn't a tremendous gap between the different criterion. So you'll never see more than a gap of 2 between any of the two things. So for example, number 9, parasite, and number 10, poor behavioral control, you won't have a gap of 55 or so. You only have at most a gap of 2 between those two criteria. So that's what I, as an example of in fact, actually, Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist is the gold standard today, highly successful in determining who is and who isn't a psychopath, and it's broadly used of training. It requires the people a great deal ask the questions and do the assessing. They try to take out as much subjectivity as possible, as much bias as possible. And that's important in a score, because especially when you're comparing things. And what I'm, it really doesn't concern me so much, but I think that people could misuse a scoring system that isn't necessarily established in a scientific basis, one that hasn't been peer reviewed, one that hasn't really been calibrated in any way, and nor has it been, how do you go about scoring? Well, it's your general feeling on the matter, your opinion, which could be biased and not subjective, or not objective. It could be quite subjective. So I think that there is a problem with doing something like Telltale did, because people are going to say, hey, this is great, I can look at my religion. If you go to Stephen Hassan's website, he has a list of A to Z of religions and associations and companies and such that are considered cults, including Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step program. So I think people are going to go out and try using this, and they're going to say, hey, this is a cult, and maybe somebody else will find that it's not a cult because of their own opinions. So there's no standardization, there's no means of removing that bias in this scoring system. So I think Telltale could have been a little bit more careful in qualifying his methodology, warning individuals in using this, that this is not a scientific scoring system. It was something that he kind of made up arbitrarily, and I've done this myself many times at work throughout my career, setting up risk models and scoring risk, and because of the nature of the work I do, I've done it. And I think that there is a time and a place for these types of things, but I think we as atheists, the idea of rationality and skepticism, we need to be somewhat cautious, because we're critical. We're critical of religion for their lack of rationality, the lack of critical thinking, and their lack of using the scientific method. And so we ought to be a little more careful in our observations and critiques of these different things. And if we roll something out like this, we don't want something, you know, that can be pointed at and said, look, you guys are guilty of the things you're accusing us of. You know, you're going to call me a cult, and who says I'm a cult? Just because of some arbitrary scoring system that there are legitimate objections to that could be made, and legitimate critiques that could be made on it. Again, I think he was trying to be somewhat creative, and I think that I think that what he did was not something that can't be done, but I think it's something that needs more thinking and needs collaboration, needs to be done scientifically, and I think the number of things I had written out here, I think I lost it, but I think my points are there. I think the things that I'm a little concerned with are made clear. I didn't intend to make this video that long. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, I think the points made. And again, I really like Telltale, and for the most part, I think he's right on the money. He does a good job. I do think that he could have thought a little better about this, rolling out this idea of a scoring against cults. You know how bad a cult is. So anyway, you got my thoughts. And this is Telltale. Not Telltale. I'm sorry. This is Truth Seeker. Wishing you all a good evening. The sun's poking out from under the cloud, and I think I'll go fly my drone and have a interesting evening. I like flying my drone, so I have other things in life that I enjoy. So long, everybody, and I wish my best to you all.